Well, I was born on a farm in southern Alberta, Vulcan, and I lived on the farm until 28 when we moved to Calgary, and did my school at Calgary from 28 to. Those were bad, poor years. My dad died when I was 11, and we didn't have too much in the way of money to think about going to university, so I was figuring that I would get involved in maybe going back and helping on farms, but we still had a farm. I had two brothers, and one of them went through for agriculture, and so I thought, well, he would be the one that'd be going to the farm. And at that time, I joined the Navy, and I went away for 4 years. While I was in the Navy, I thought of the farm and growing things, and was really interested in doing something with growing, and figuring, well, I can't go to the farm, what else could I do? And so I thought of forestry. I thought of silviculture, forestry. Of course, on the prairie, you don't have any forests there. But I got my discharge in Vancouver and went to UBC and took forestry. And the main reason was that I was interested in growing plants, figuring that trees were similar to a crop, similar to grain, that you could cut it the same. The rotation was longer, but it was the same idea. And when I finished university, the jobs weren't too plentiful. That was in 1950, and there was an awful lot of people. So it was difficult to pick and choose, but I did get a job as in the Forest Service in Prince Rupert on a cruising crew. And cruising crew was all these applications. Everything was sort of expanding. There was all kinds of activity, and there was lots of areas to get ready to sell to the little sawmills that were springing up all over the country. And we had many. My memory doesn't get back to the exact number of sawmills, but we had a lot of small sawmills. We had a lot of small sails that we had to get cruised up and ready for them. And the ranger could do some of them, but it was left to the region, the district office, to have a crew that went out and did the larger sails. So I did that for a year. Well, then I had experience as a ranger in Chilliwack while I was going to university. Each summer I went out into the ranger office. And the opportunity came to go to Ocean Falls as the ranger. And I still believe that the ranger's job is one of the most important in the Forest Service, because you are right on the ground. And the ranger should have a tenure. He should be there for longer than, develop a theme and get the areas developed and get the ideas going that this is the proper way to do it. But that wasn't had happened to me. I got transferred back to Prince Rupert in protection. Actually, they were looking for people to sort of round out their careers, and because of the experience in the Rangers, well, then protection was good because I had to deal with all the Rangers on all the fires, and I spent a year on that. And because I'd shown interest in silviculture, well, the job came available. They got a silviculturist into the Prince Rupert area, and so I got that appointment to look after silviculture. But I was only there a year, and I applied and got a job in Victoria. So in 1954, I moved to Victoria as a junior forester in a timber management branch.
So you went to Victoria in 1954?
1954. And at that time, the Forest Service was really getting down to the nitty-gritty, where we had to do some definite planning. And there was a planning division, there was an inventory division, there was a timber division. And the planning division were responsible for setting up public sustained yield unit, or no, public working circles, I should say, public working circles. And then they had already developed the tree farm, or the forest management license, and there was a number of them that had been issued. A forest management license is issued to a company or a corporation that would manage a certain area, and they were responsible for doing inventory and laying out the cut blocks and building the roads and everything under agreement from the Forest Service as cutting permits in this forest management license. The public area was set up in public working circles, and each one of the public working circles, the planning division set it up. Then we were responsible for administering it, and we would find out who was working in that area, how much they were cutting, and how much we had to sell in that area, how much volume. And they were given a quota. Now, this quota, you could say given it, but they had to buy the timber. They had to bid it in. It wasn't given to them like the management license, where they didn't have to bid on the timber after they'd got the license. Well, this went along, and we kept developing it and creating more working circles. Then I've forgotten the exact year, but they had a change in thought at the legislature. We had a bit of a problem, and they didn't like the word public working circles and forest management license, so they changed the names to tree farm license for forest management license and public sustained yield units for public working circles. Now that was just a change in name as far as administration was concerned, but it's quite a spectacular move, and everything had to be changed to agree. The cuts were all on IU, and that meant that they weren't utilizing the small tops of the trees. They had a 1-foot stump to a 6-inch top, and that was the volume of timber that was being sold. Then the development, we found that we had pulp mills using the smaller material, and so we insisted that the timber be cut down to a 4-inch top, and we were able to utilize a lot more of the areas, and we got into a lot of areas that were stagnant pine stands that you should cut to get them back into production, and some of the other areas. The small material was used mainly in the pulping process. Then the sawmill industry developed, and they developed stud mills. Stud mills used nothing but the small material, and they just made studs. And the refuse from it, the bark and stuff, or the edgings, were all chopped up and sent to the pulp mill. So that was a further development. The pulp mills were building all over the country, north and south and east and west, and using more and more chips. Some of them were using material that couldn't be put into saw logs. It was there would be rot in it, and it wasn't worth putting through a sawmill because there was too much waste. So that material was going directly to the pulp mills. They'd just chip it up and send it to the pulp mill. Also, the development of a chipboard was developed, and there was a, I think it's still over at Grand Forks. It's a very important part of the utilization, but it makes a very heavy board. It's glue and chips. It makes a heck of a good board, but it's heavy. A lot of furniture is made out of chipboard. They also started developing areas in the far north that were using aspen, and because it couldn't be used anywhere else, they aspenite board. But in this country here, the development is going back. There's a lot of white pine, and at one time there was a mill in Nelson that cut white pine and for match blocks, and it was running for years. It finally packed it up in the early 50s and closed down because the market was, I guess, people closer to the match factories were able to give them a product. When in town, Kootenay Forest Products expanded, I should say. It was there, and they expanded and used material. There was other sawmills, Creston sawmills, Grand Forks sawmills. There was a lot of Klasnikoff, and there was a lot of smaller sawmills all through. But those sawmills are still here today. They bought up the smaller quotas and mills in order to have sufficient material to put through their mills. Now you might say, well, why would they not continue to operate on the small sawmill? Well, the small sawmill operator, he had to compete with selling his material with the larger companies, and he had usually just a rough product. And some of them continued to do that. There was one at Caslow that worked up there for years and was able to compete with all the bigger companies. But eventually, they just couldn't sell, or for one reason or other, maybe they got an offer they just couldn't refuse from a mill that needed more timber and couldn't get it excepting by buying out somebody that had an existing quota. There was a lot of objections to the quota system, feeling that it was given more benefit to the people that had it, and it was impossible for somebody to come along and get it at a later date. Well, that was true, but you couldn't continue to sell in a sustained yield unit. You couldn't continue to give new sales. If you did, what's going to happen to the established industry? They're not going to have enough and they were developing on the basis of what was in that unit. If they overdeveloped, then we had no compunctions about giving them more timber in that unit. They'd have to either buy out somebody or move someplace else. So that was the idea.
When was the quota system established?
It was established in the 50s. I haven't got that in the back of my mind, but it's...
Was it at the point where you were in Victoria?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. When I was in Victoria, we were responsible for the overall administration of that, and as they were proposed, well, we would go and discuss it. I and the others in my branch would go out to the region, and we would discuss it with them and get this, and then it'd be sort of finalized, and we'd have to put it to the chief forester and say, well, this is the quotas, and this is the volume we've got to sell, and this is the quotas. Well, in some cases, we had more volume than the unit had use for, and in other cases, they were already using more timber than what the sustained yield unit was capable of using. So the quotas were cut back, or the volume that they were getting was cut back to give them a quota. Once they had the quota, Then it's just recently that the quotas have been, the sustained yield. After you cut the mature timber and you take out all the land that is used for other uses that wasn't apparent at the time of setting up the quotas, then there's sometimes not the same volume that was in the original quota, so that everybody has to take a downturn in their quotas. And that is done through the chief forester and the legislation.
Was the quota system more important to the development of certain regions of the province? Was it of the same importance on the coast as in the southern interior or the northern interior?
Well, that's a good question. Now, in the coast, the majority of the companies were larger. Because if you wanted to start up a sawmill on the coast, you had to have a camp, and usually because they're not in a community, you had to go up Redonda or up some South Bentic Arm or someplace, and there was no community there, so you had to start a community, and you had to have more volume. The only other thing was the hand logger, and the hand logger, he just went out, he just had a boat, and he'd go out and he'd cut a few sticks and come back. But if a guy wanted to get an A-frame or something, well, he'd have to get a fair-sized crew together to do that. So the quota system there was very important because they'd had to know what they were going to have. In the interior, you could build a road and live in town and go out and cut 10 acres here or 10 acres there, and it wasn't too. And you could also travel further afield. If you lived in Cranbrook, you could cut in Creston, or you could cut up it. But on the coast, with boat being the transportation system, you would have more problem. So I guess that I hadn't thought of it, but I would say that the quota system was more important on the coast than in the interior.
Were you involved in establishing the quota system here? I know you were in Victoria.
It was yes. When it was established here, yeah.
Do you have some recollection of the development of it here in this region and how that?
Well, see, this region, there was the Granby Public Sustained Yield. There's a whole lot of public sustained yield units that are in this area that were administered from Nelson. Some of them were more critical than others, that's for sure.
What do you mean?
Grand Forks and there wasn't a lot of extra timber there to give out. Here in the Kootenays, we had all of Kootenay Lake, and there was a lot more area and very difficult to develop area. The Duncan Dam wasn't in at that time. There was all that area up there, and there was one piece of private land that's just down here, the tree farm, just down the way here. The private company had held it for years and years. I'm not sure who owns it right now, but a German company had it while I was here.
Darkwoods.
Yeah.
Still do.
They do. And the Kootenays, trying to think of where we really had problems. I think there was a lot of competition in the Creston area because there's Wendell Box, Hushcrofts, Creston Sawmills at that time, Crestbrook now. There was another couple. There was sort of an overabundance of mills there, and there was real competition.
And Kootenay Forest Products also took timber from down that way, the
Well,
boundary.
Yes, they did. They had operations. They had camps at one time down in that area. Then the roads went through and they abandoned their camps. They had a lot of development all the way up the lake. In fact, they used to tow the logs down the lake.
Well, I wondered how, what the basis for the quotas were. Was it based on historical cut?
It was based mainly on historical cut. Yeah. And availability of timber in the unit to agree to the allowable annual cut of the unit.
Was it an average of the past 5 years of cutting?
Yes, we averaged. That's right. That averaged it over. Some of them were a 3-year average. Some of them 5 years. It all depended how much timber there was in the unit. If it was a lot of timber, well, you'd take the last 5 years, or I think there was some of them that were just on 1 year, just what was your cut last year, and we were able to use it. But most of them were an average of a number of years.
For some of the very small operators, basing the quota on just 1 year's cutting might have created difficulties.
Well, there was a lot of them that were. Well, we had a minimum. We if the guy didn't cut very much, well, we had just a small amount that we would get, and the trouble with the small ones, they usually would buy out their neighbor if they wanted a little larger. So 2 of them would combine to get enough to live on, if that was the case. The small ones, and this was a statement that I remember making to the newspaper in Prince Rupert when I first went there. I said to this newspaper fellow that we've got a lot of small operators now, but I said eventually it's going to be that we'll only have a very few, and they'll be large, because that's the only way it can go. You can't hold back progress. You can't hold it so that the individual is able to hold it, because he gets old and he's not interested anymore, or he breaks his leg and he's no longer able to manage his affairs. So the only way he can get out with anything is to sell. And by establishing a quota, we were able to give that man a little better than if he hadn't a quota. Then he'd just have to, that's it. That's the end. You don't get anything more. You can't buy a timber sale because you can't utilize it. So you just are out. So the quota was good in that respect. It did give the guy a chance to get some value from his work over the years. But you could see the writing on the wall, but I got the guy didn't think too much of that, because he was thinking that, we want to have all these, everybody should have a chance to log, and I agreed, but I said that's not the reality. You're going to find that the more aggressive are going to buy out the less aggressive, and the poorer operator is not going to be able to compete with the better operator. And some of them, I hate to say that I'm afraid that some of them, they got to the legislature, the politicians, and they were able to influence them to an extent. It seemed that certain ones got a better benefit than others, not always on the basis of performance. But that's our democratic society at work.
When did you move then from the position in Victoria to Nelson?
Well, in 1966. I was competed for the job of in charge of timber in the district.
Can you describe for me a little bit of the situation when you came to Nelson in terms of the timber management and the forest industry?
Well, we're at a fairly critical time then, because at that time we were really getting into the idea that we wanted utilization to improve. We could see that there wasn't unlimited timber, and we had to get the last cubic foot out of every area that our inspections were more important. We put more emphasis on getting the ranger staff to do inspections, and then they were assessed as they came through the office. And we are also very concerned about regeneration on the area. So each area was being inspected after it was logged to see what the preparations had to be, such as we had some areas that we'd have to burn because in this area you have a lot of overmature hemlock was the worst, and cedar, and they'd fall this, and sometimes they'd fall a cedar or a hemlock on top of a cedar, and it'd break both of them up, and so you'd have a lot of slivers and stuff. And we've had cases where you get out onto you go up to Golden, you'd find areas that you had about 4 feet of slash on the ground. You couldn't get down to the ground. Well, there's no way that you're going to get a seedling to grow through all that slash. And it's a tremendous fire hazard too on top of that. So you've got to get back to mineral soil, and you've got to get rid of your hazard. So the only thing you can do is do a controlled burn. So that's the reason we have these large areas that are burned. They logged them because they were over mature and they had to be put back into production.
And would there have been sufficient timber values on those stands to log them profitably?
Yeah, they could log them all right. In fact, there was some choice timber. Some of the logs would be really good, but there was a lot of them that were falling down, ready to fall down. Some of them even falling down. You could go through in cruising. You'd go through and you'd find a lot of windfalls because they were not capable of continuing vigorous growth. So we had those areas that were being examined, and you had to get that area prepared. And in that case, you had to slash burn it, and it had to be a fairly hot burn. Some of those escaped. That was the gamble that you took. But we also had fires that were caused by cigarettes going out the car window and or whatever other case, lightning strike, and get into an area and create a fire in fire season that was very difficult to control, and we'd get the slash burned off, but then we'd usually get an awful lot of good timber that would be burned at the same time. Well, then you had to utilize as much of that good timber as you could by logging it as soon as you could so that it wouldn't be blown down and rot. So some of these large areas got even larger because of the way nature, not planned, but nature would do it. Then we had areas in the Carmi, Beaverdale area that you had, there was a couple of situations. You'd want to scarify it to get some of the moss and get the area, the ground stirred up so that you could get seedlings to grow. A lot of this was based on the idea that we could get natural regen if we had we weren't too far from a seed source. In the large clear cuts, you couldn't. So we had to get the mineral soil and then get planting crews to go out and plant. And we were, at that time, we had large planting crews going out and planting up these areas.
In the mid-60s?
Yep. Mm-hmm. You had to decide what you were going to plant. You had to plant trees from seed that came from that general area. We could, I can remember being in Prince Rupert, and they Douglas fir is the big tree that everybody thinks that. So the tree farm license was owned by people in New York, and they said, well, you better plant Douglas fir. So they actually put in Douglas fir. Well, it's outside its range, and they all died. You don't see Douglas fir in Prince Rupert. It's just not. It doesn't grow up there. You'd have to have it in your garden and plant and water it and look after it, and then it'd be stunted.
What about here?
Oh, here.
Did you have a nursery?
Yes. Well, we had a nursery at Cranbrook that was looking after this area, but it doesn't matter where the nursery is. It's where the seed was picked. So we could take seed and plant it at Green Timbers and bring it back here, because they had to keep track of where they got the seed. They planted it. And we created nurseries. We had, there was a few problems, like the one at Cranbrook. After many years of use, we found that it was in the wrong spot because it got early frost and various things. But they now have one at Harrop here, and they've got Red Rock in Prince George is a big nursery, and I'm sure they got more of them, but I don't know where they are now. So you had to plant the tree that was similar to that was local in order to get your best tree for growing in that area.
Was there a system in place when you came here to collect seeds?
Oh, yes. They had to collect seed. They had to send it to the nursery and sort of stratify it so that it would be got proper. And we then started to get involved in the computer. It was a very elementary system that they used back in those days. But we started getting cards for all of this and putting it into banks so that you knew exactly what was there. Because that's one of the problems that we have in forestry is back history. And what was done, when it was done, and why it was done, and what were the results. And in order to get all that, then now we can do something, because if with that information we can really do a lot. We're still developing that. Right this week they're having a field trip down in Grand Forks to assess, in conjunction with the Americans, now what is being done here, why was it done, and what can we do to improve it. We're still learning. Something like forestry, it's a 100-year process. You go to a farm and it's a 1-year process. You put in, it wasn't too long in the prairies that they found that certain wheat was better than other wheat, and they were able to grow it. But here, well, we have to wait for years to find out whether it was the best or not, because it takes time to develop. In Nelson area, we're very fortunate that we've got more tree species than any other area. We got cedar and fir and larch and balsam fir and hemlock and there's about 15 of them that we have that we can actually cut commercially. You get to Prince George and you got 4 spruce and pine and fir and stuff. The coast is the same. You don't have as many species. White pine here too, and regular pine, jack pine. So this is a wonderful area to get involved in forestry, because it's so interesting, so diversified. Every area isn't just all fir or all something else. It's you go onto a stand and you can see many species on the same sale, which is that was when we used to sell timber. You'd have a long list of the species and the volumes of each, and they'd have to bid on each one of them. You'd get one in Prince George, and you got fir, or you got spruce or pine, and maybe they have 3, and that was all.
Were you involved in the setting up the bids for timber sales in Nelson, or was that a different
Well, that's the appraisal part, and that is in timber. But we had an appraisal officer that was to expand on that, we had a crew in Victoria collecting prices. They went throughout the province, traveled every month, and went, you didn't depend on the people sending it in. They went to each one of the companies and looked at their books to see what they were getting for the timber. And they then used that. It was the average selling price that was used to come up with the value of the timber. The appraisal system is very complicated. We used the value of the timber that was collected from this Victoria crew, and we found that the cost of equipment, the cost of labor, the cost of developing the area, and all of these costs had to go into it. And you come with the volume of the timber and the value, and you came down, and we give it an estimated stumpage. And that would be, in the case of auctions, well, it would be bid up. In the case of areas that they didn't have auctions, that would be the price they'd have to pay for the timber.
Did that have a name, that price?
That was the upset price. So you'd have all the appraisals would be handled through the appraisal officer. The sale would come up, and there would be anyone could. It was advertised for a certain period of time, and then people could come and bid on it. And the fellow that had the quota, he had the prior. He could get it, but he would often have competition on it too.
Were you responsible for determining what the annual allowable cut would be in the Nelson region?
No, that was established inventory division in Victoria. They were continually doing inventory to find out what the volume of timber was. And they created the allowable cut and would put it up, and the chief forester had to agree to it. They would take into account all of the things that were, as developments go, they'd have to take out the parks, and they'd have to take out this, that, and the other thing, and they would add in the areas that were logged to show what was going to be the increase in cut and all of that. And that cut was determined by inventory and approved by the chief forester and administered by the district.
But the level of the allowable cut must have affected your responsibilities or your job. Changes in it if it changed.
Well, yes, if it changed, then our administration would have to deal with that. Yes.
Did it change during that time?
Actually, during that time, no, because we were still on the developing. Growth was it wasn't until much later that we started to get problems in having enough timber. And then, of course, once we didn't have the timber, then the problems came as to how we were going to deal with it. But the developments, public, they didn't like waste, seeing waste on the lakes and stuff, and then roads were developed, and logs were hauled in by truck rather than put into the water, because there was a lot of complaints about waste material. You know, the booms would break up in the storm, and there'd be logs all over, and the boats would be running into them. You'd be ending up on shores, and the company were losing money, and insurance. There was all kinds of problems with booming and hauling logs by water. But it was the most efficient in some of the northern interior places. They used to have the log drives down the rivers, and of course that the fisheries, various things that to stir up the bottom of the river, and knock all things all over, and they'd get log jams, and they would have to clear them out with dynamite and everything. But they'd get the logs to the mills the mills were on the lakes up there. Then they started, because of the muskeg, it's a real problem in logging up there. They often would bring out all their logs in the winter on the ice roads. The old ice roads. Now, if you ever had to do inspections and you went up to do an inspection in one of these areas and you found a truck coming down with a load of logs, he had right away, you had to get the heck off. Sometimes it's very difficult. But that was the way they logged their logs. Their year's supply would be on the ice roads because the muskeg wouldn't allow them to haul it out in the summer until they started to build gravel roads. Gravel is very scarce in a lot of the areas up there. They had to haul it for miles and miles. We didn't have that same problem here. The only problem we had was developing, getting roads built, because the country was new. They had railways. They used to have 3 or 4 railways on this lake, up to Sandon and stuff. But it wasn't into every community. They used to have the boats, and the boats used to service the lake. They'd go into every little community. Then they all disappeared. Then the roads had to come, and the cost of developing, like Coffee Creek there, has been a problem for years. It used to be a real problem when I was here, that it'd be closed because it'd be sloughing down on the road.
The main highway?
Yeah, this road right up here to Caslow, the main road.
Did you have a road building program
in the
60s?
Yes, we did. We had our engineers were building road, and there's a lot of roads that were built by the Forest Service that were forestry roads. And forestry roads, we put them in where we wanted them to develop an area. If there was sufficient, say one company, a big company had an area where we wouldn't build a road for them. Excuse me. Yep. The Forest Service is responsible for administering the forests of British Columbia through the Forest Act. And anything that is done has to be according to the Act. Everybody knows the Act. The companies know the Act. They can't do anything that don't agree with it. And the only things that we can do have to be in agreement with the Act. Well, then on top of that, we've got a professional foresters association. And professional foresters are dedicated to professional forestry. They want the trees to be handled in a professional manner. Everybody isn't a professional that is operating in the forest, but the Forest Service has the government have decided that the Forest Service shall have professional foresters administering the forests of the province. So there's the two. The foresters then, they have an association, and they have rules that they have to abide by. Now, they are guided by those rules. So if the forester is working for the government, he has to do the work of the government, but he can't do work that is not in agreement with foresters' code of ethics. the companies are required, the bigger companies are required to have professional foresters. And those foresters also are governed by the Association of Professional Foresters. So they can't do something that is radically wrong with proper forestry, or they'll be brought up on the carpet of the Professional Foresters group. Then you've got all of our policies are benefited to the forest. We don't create a policy that isn't going to be of some good to the forest. We wouldn't say you got to go out and clear cut that area if we found that that is not good policy. We have foresters that are involved in reforestation, in research, in inventory, in management of the forest. All of those foresters are more involved in the forest than any guy that's walking in off the street that just sees a clear cut and wonders, well, that's wrong. Well, there's a lot of thought gone into managing that forest by professional foresters and by the acts that have been created by previous foresters and laymen. They are involved in it too. So you just can't have every area treated by one guy, not in conjunction with all of the policies that are in place.
Well, it's interesting that earlier you commented on how important the forest ranger was.
Right.
And I have a sense that there's different traditions in the Forest Service, and one was the ranger whose knowledge came strongly from experience,
yes,
rather than professional training, and that in the 60s there was a change with the expansion of the role of the professional forester. Is that true?
Actually, they've never given the ranger the classification that I think he should have, in that he would be responsible for the area and stay in that area, administering and be a forester. The reason I say being a forester is, sure, we had the people that came in as professional foresters under the grandfather clause that were not foresters, but had been working in the forests all their lives, and they were in the positions of looking after the forest, and were quite capable of carrying on forestry as agreed to by the Forest Act and the Professional Foresters Act. So they were brought in and under the grandfather clause, which is fine. Now the rangers, I think I still feel that their job is they're right on the area. They know what has gone on. They've got the benefit of the silviculturist, of and they know what the local weather, the local conditions in every respect are, and they can really do a better job than anybody else for that particular area, and on the basis of professional forestry work. But it was interesting. When I had my interview to get into the Forest Service, they have asked you a number of questions, and at that time, St. Clair was the fellow that he was the assistant chief forester, and I mentioned that because of my experience in the ranger and forestry, I felt at that time, I said, well, all rangers should be professional foresters. I made that statement to him right there. And a year later, I was put out as a ranger, and I thought, well, this is good. This is what they're going to do. But there's been quite a few more since then, but it wasn't an overall policy that they did. Not that I know of. And of course, I've been out of it now for 9 years, so I don't know what the heck they're doing. You're not kept up to date.
Did you negotiate different utilization standards for different timber sales depending on the state of the individual stand, the mix of species and age and composition?
Well, when you say negotiate, when the cruiser goes out and cruises the area, he assesses the whole thing. He assesses whether it's the cedar is over mature or whether there's a lot of rot in it or conks or whatever, and he does that with every species. So actually, all of that is taken into consideration. That's for sure. That's a good point. It is. But it's not negotiated to the extent that you say, well, you're going to have to pay more. It's actually developed in the proper inventory basis. Assessment, analyzing it.
You said that 1966, in the period when you came to Nelson, was a critical time for a change in utilization and improvement in utilization. How did the companies respond to those changes?
Well, the companies, they had to, we had a bit of problem because we had small companies that couldn't utilize to the close utilization because they just, you get a sawmill that had a 1/4-inch saw curve, well, it's going to have a heck of a job cutting anything that's 4 inches with that. So there was a bit of problem, and we had to put quite a bit of pressure on them. The bigger companies had to improve their sawmills by bringing in saws that could utilize to the smaller diameter. Also, that they had to sort of get more efficient sawmill. Everything was pushing them to do a better job. We couldn't tell them what they had to have, but we could tell them what they had to do or get assessed. Now, if they didn't utilize to the extent, then they were assessed. And they said, well, we're going to pay for that because we can't afford to do it. But there's only a certain amount of that we would stand for until we'd say, well, we're not going to allow you to cut that because you can't utilize it.
Did that actually happen?
Well, I'm sure it did.
Is there an example of that
No,
here?
I can't think of one.
And was there an appeal process for the assessment?
Well,
if you assessed Kootenay Forest products, for example.
Yeah. If we assessed Kootenay Forest products, then they objected, they would go to the district forester, and if they weren't happy with that, then they would go to the chief forester and see what they could do.
Was that common?
Well, it was. There was. When I went back to Victoria, we used to have a number of people that were hired consultants that would be professionals that came to fight the case for the bigger companies, and you'd see them come into the chief forester's office, and we used to have a name for them. Sometimes they'd get something changed, and we would, but if they did, well, then we just had to administer according to that change, but we weren't always happy with the change. A lot of that detail, I don't remember. If it didn't go my way, well, then we had to do it the proper way or the way they wanted it or whatever it was. And there's no use dwelling on it and crying over spilt milk or saying, well, I object to that and I'm unhappy for the rest of my life. If that was the way it had been, I'd have got out of the Forest Service. But I put my cases forward, and if I got beat down, well, then I would have to administer according to what was required. Not that I'd do it cheerfully all the time, but I would try and forget it.
So the utilization standards were tougher on some of the companies than others, depending on how able they were to invest in more efficient equipment?
Well, I wouldn't say it was tougher on them, but what I would say is that certain companies, they went further in using material and maybe even more than what we required, which was always the case. Just because we had a 4-inch top diameter, well, a lot of them would bring it down to 3, and we didn't require that, but they would bring it down to 3. When you say that certain companies would be forced, it wasn't us forcing them to use it further, but they did use it further because there was solid wood there, and they could see a value in it, and they could. It was just as sensible for them to take it out to a better utilization than what was required, which was fine because our utilization was. We considered it to be a good utilization. It wasn't the top utilization, but we didn't want anything. The odd case of less utilization was maybe got by and without assessment, but we had all kinds of assessment. In fact, in the early days, in Prince Rupert, we used to get a 10% deposit from when we'd sell the sale. They'd have to put up 10%, and I'd say 75% of them would lose their 10% deposit because we would find that there was that much waste or infractions. So we would assess it. That was all over. But I know it was up in Rupert because I was there. It was all over.
And why would they lose that deposit? What would they do to it?
Well, they would there would be all kinds of them. Maybe they left logs on the area. They'd say, "Oh well." In the logging in the wintertime, they'd lose a lot of logs, and they wouldn't go back and log them. And it wasn't worth their time to set up a camp to go back to log, or they weren't using to the top diameter required, or the stump heights were too high. All of those reasons, and we'd assess them, and they wouldn't get their 10% deposit back, maybe even more. And there used to be some of them, that would try, and they would get their 10% back. And if we assessed them, they would fight, say, well, what is it? And we'd find, and they'd say, all right, yeah, that's fair game. A lot of them, a lot of the bigger companies, you see, when the tree farm license or the forest management license came along, and the bigger companies started hiring foresters, and they were classmates of ours, so we were having to deal with them. The company was up here, we would deal with them, and they were having trouble convincing their management that they had to practice forestry, because they were interested in the buck, and they said, well, we'll do as little as we have to, and we want as much profit. And so they wanted their foresters to do this, and there was a lot of them that had real trouble with their companies because of us insisting on certain things. And there was others that were ahead of the game. I can remember a company that we were always very happy with, because we would go out and we'd find that they were even doing a better job than what we had expected. And they had large foresters, more than one, they'd have them, and they were responsible for the various things. But that wasn't, it wasn't in the case of every one of them.
Well, you've mentioned utilization as one of the key issues for you in that time when you were in charge of timber management here. Were there some other issues, some problem areas problems you were trying to solve, or?
Well, I think that the proper logging, the utilization is part of it, but it's leaving the area in a proper state. Some of them, you can't go into an area, say, in the wintertime and expect to do proper utilization because there's too much snow. Some of them were in that state. you try and encourage them to log in the summertime or something where you'd get scarification so that it'd improve the area rather than to log it on the snow and then you get all this extra cost that is going to be involved. Development of the areas was a real problem. We had to big equipment is just coming into the country. There was a shortage of it, I guess, the proper road building equipment, and sometimes the roads wouldn't be to a standard that would be acceptable to hauling that material out. We had many cases of examining areas as they were building roads that they hadn't put in enough drainage, and they'd put it in the wrong spots. And so we would say, well, geez, you're going to have sloughs on here, or you're going to wash this out, or it's not going to be acceptable. And so that was a real important part.
But did all that have to be planned in advance?
Yes.
But how could they have sited a road in a certain way, or failed to put in the culverts if it was? Was it all laid out in plans?
It was laid out, yeah.
And then they didn't build the plan.
They didn't build it to a plan.
And these would be larger watersheds where a company had a big timber sale or a development area?
Yes.
And that would be primarily which companies?
Well, it'd have to be the bigger companies. Any of the companies that were going to build a road, they had to build it according to standard, and they couldn't. Drainage is one of the top priorities, and width of road and alignment, and if they're going to be using it a lot, well, then there'd be certain requirements about gravel. You can't have a mud hole.
So that was another case of the company trying to reduce their costs.
Yeah. They would try and do it as cheap as they could. Some of them were luckier than others in that they'd get areas that is all they had to do was just bulldoze a road in and put a ditch along the side of it, and that was all. And others, you'd have side hill that was coming down and a road come along here, and the water would come, and if it couldn't get across the road, well, it'd just wash the road out and continue on down into the lake or the river or the creek or the town or whatever.
Can you give me some examples? I'm just trying to understand this point a little bit better. It would help me you could use it, whether it would be the Trout Lake area or the Duncan River or somewhere that you can describe its development.
Well, that if you went up Redfish Creek or Bus Creek or any of those creeks, and you followed their road all the way up, those were built by companies, and the requirements were put in there, and you'll see that the odd slough, I'm sure, has occurred. But the companies had an engineering crew, and we had an engineering crew that would check them. I gather that our engineer forestry just put through that Grey Creek road over there. The power line is over there, and they opened that up. They put through a road there, and I haven't been over it, but you might be interested to go through to Kimberley that way. It's just through the clouds are down in that valley there, straight over there, and the power line goes up there, and the Forest Service built the road.
Were you involved at all in the way that the Columbia River Treaty affected forestry in this area? Could you talk a bit about that?
Prefer not to.
That seems like a pretty important point.
I had no say in it whatsoever.
But it must have had
Yeah.
quite an effect.
Right. Yeah. That was political all the way, and so we just have to administer it accordingly. I have no.
The pulp mill in Castlegar was operating by the time you came here, wasn't it?
Yes, it was operating, and that was when the Arrow Lakes and there was Kootenay Side Dam and everything was put in after that. Yeah, there was a pulp mill there. The Skookumchuck, I think it was built while I was here. And that's the only two that we had around here. It was very interesting trying to work around Columbia.
Why wasn't there a pulp mill built in Kootenay Lake?
Well, that's a good question. We were able to utilize the material over there, and when Crestbrook, they were the ones that were the main operators here. There was more objections to having a pulp mill on the lake here. I think public objections. And they didn't know where to put it, I guess. So they put it over at Skookumchuck, and they had the one down at Castlegar. But there was certainly material here at that time. But now, I guess they've sorted it all out, and they haul chips so many miles. It's hundreds of miles they'll haul the chips now. So they don't need another pulp mill here. Nobody wants a pulp mill by time. We lived right in Ocean Falls for the year, and the pulp mill was right there. You know, it just was here to the corner there. And the prevailing wind took it up into Link Lake, excepting the odd time it had come down into the town. And it was a really strong smell when it came down, because it was an old pulp mill, and it did have a strong smell. But it wasn't all that. You know, we survived the year. Even KFP and their beehive burner there used to create a havoc, because fly ash went all over the lower Fairfield there. Fairview, I should say. Well, public, they have a right to. This is their country just as much as it is anyone else's, and the public outcry is accepted, and you work within the parameters of what the public want, as well as what is the right thing to do.
Were you involved in the building of the Duncan Hall Road?
The Duncan Hall Road?
The road that goes up the Duncan.
Our engineering were, yeah. Yeah, it was paid for by Hydro, and they built it, same as one at Revelstoke. All those were paid for by others, and the engineering was done mainly by them, because they had to get above the high water, and they had to do this, that, and the other thing. But our engineering did look at them to see that it wasn't going to adversely affect anything of ours.
Well, I wonder if there are other aspects to your job as head of timber management for the Nelson region that you might describe. You mentioned the silviculture, the tree planting.
Yeah, silviculture. Art Baldy was involved in silviculture here, and he lives in town. Ray Gill was involved in reforestation. He did a heck of a lot of work on that, establishing it, Ray Gill. And Bill Huff, I guess, no, he died. Who else is around here? You were talking to Bob Robinson.
Yes.
He was the ranger here for years.
Well, companies like Kootenay Forest Products had to develop 5-year plans.
Yes.
Were you responsible for looking those plans over and approving them?
They had to be approved. They had to. When you say responsible, we had input from all of the. Yes, they had to have the input from our engineering, from our silviculturists. It was all involved protection, and it would be approved by our district forester rather than because there was more than one facet of it. It had to be considered.
But you would.
Oh yes, it was input. Yeah.
What were some of the concerns you had in looking at those plans?
That's a long time ago.
Well, I'm thinking of balanced harvesting.
Well, that's true. It was just a logical sort of development. You had to make sure that you weren't going to log from the front of the valley right through to the back, which is the most economic, and according to the economist, it would be the best way to do it. Then you'd log and plant and scarify and do all the work, and log and plant and go on and protect and go right through to the back, and you'd gain. It would be the most economic, and you'd do the best job, supposedly. But we required that you get in and you would have a cut block at the front end, but then the next cut block would be a long way along, and then you'd get back to the back end because we were selling the timber. We want access in there. We don't want you to start logging and then say, well, we can't do anything and drop the whole thing, and we've lost all the benefits that would have occurred. So yes, we had to make sure that the first plan showed that they were going to be developing the valley according to what we felt was a logical plan. Then that's just the overall. Then the sophisticated plan would come later, where you'd have the cut blocks set up and more development put into them. They'd have to tell you exactly what was the species and everything else, so that you'd be able to assess it. I think one of the things we had quite a few meetings that you had to deal with public and timber management. I guess I was involved with as much in the way of public input as anybody in the district. You'd have the protection, you'd have to have anybody complaining about fires, well, they'd deal with them. And timber, we had all kinds of meetings on this, that, and the other creek, the same as they have now. In fact, I'm sure they have more of them now because they had more public input. But it was the start of the public reaction to what was being done. I think that some of the reasons that a lot of that happened was because of such things as the flooding of the dams and creating these great areas and the public had no input. Well, then they got up in arms. Well, then they started looking at some of the other things that were going on. And
like what?
Like our logging in the areas. They said, well, we're going to have to say, we lost all that area to a lake. We don't want to lose this area. And we don't want to lose that area. And so the public got more involved, which I agree, it's acceptable. You should, Bill Young is he used to be chief forester. He's retired in Victoria, and he's got a forest history society. I haven't got any of the copies. And it's only a few years old, but he's got a booklet that comes out similar to this. I just got this yesterday. This is our foresters. We get this from the Professional Foresters Group. They're changing the Foresters Act here, so I was just taking a look at it when you came. Got it yesterday. He would be a good one to contact regarding the overall history of the forests and the Forest Service. A lot of it is written up in his booklets. It'd be interesting.
So you found yourself dealing with the public in a new way, you feel?
Well, when I was in the early days, you didn't have any meeting you called to determine what the stumpage was and stuff. But it got so that you had to have a meeting when you were thinking of developing an area. You had to have a meeting to let them know what was going to happen. And then sometimes the public outcry was such that you had to have they would call some type of meeting. You'd have to go and defend yourself.
Where did that happen around here?
Over in New Denver, and up at Lardo, there was quite a few meetings regarding the forest.
And Blewett?
Yes, and Blewett.
That was
I've forgotten.
Pressbrook.
Yeah, KFP and Blewett. I don't remember any specific meeting that was really. But we had O'Halloran and Corey and various others. They're well known around this country.